wanted to say hello from smoky British Columbia. We're kind of on fire up here, but let's get going. So I'll share my screen and you don't have to look at this really big weird face up there. Okay. Before we start, I want to tell you a little bit more about me and why this talk is important. Holistic testing and product quality. I started off as a programmer, did that for quite a few years, 6 years or so. And then I was asked to be a QA manager. The organization I was with wanted to make a test team. And they thought I'd be a good QA manager because I was the only programmer who was constantly trying to improve the process. Not that it was working. And even as a QA manager, I really didn't have the power to do anything, and it was a very frustrating place. So I actually quit that job and went to testing on an Agile team. And it really changed the way I view software development, quality, and a whole lot of other things. And that's when I started talking about it. I started going to conferences. I started working with other teams, trying to show what I had learned. I was very excited about it all. And then, of course, with Lisa Crispin, started writing the books and have just kept doing that ever since. I like quotes, and Edward Deming has a whole lot of them. This is one of the ones that is one of my favorites. Quality is everyone's responsibility. You improve quality and you improve productivity. I find that it's a great quote, but a lot of people misunderstand what productivity really means. The second quote here is one of mine. If you focus on quality, the speed will come. If you focus on speed, the quality gets lost. And I see this problem in a lot of organizations that are transitioning to Agile because they concentrate on getting things done faster and faster. And the quality just kind of gets forgotten about. If you concentrate on that quality, the speed comes automatically, and I've seen that over and over again. So today, the message that I'm trying to get across started based on a series of blog posts I did a while ago about testing and quality. I've been thinking a lot about the relationship between the two. There's a relationship, but they are not the same. So I'm going to talk a little bit about DevOps, continuous delivery kind of idea. And then I'm going to have a little bit about quality and then how testing supports those quality conversations. So let's start a little bit about DevOps, continuous delivery. When I hear the term DevOps or continuous delivery, all I hear is the buzzwords. And then I hear them talk about the tools and how everything is automated, and people get really excited about all of this. But I lose quite a bit because I think what we should talk about is the values and principles, the things on this slide that address the business drivers. We use the practices from the previous slide to help us accomplish delivering valuable products. DevOps is not the goal. Continuous delivery is not the goal. They are tools to help us deliver. And organizations don't adopt these DevOps or CD because of the tools. Well, maybe some do because they think it sounds really cool. But really what organizations want is consistency in their delivery. These are all the same things we say when we talk about Agile, but the focus brings the operations into the picture as well. And I think that's a really important thing. That's how we get that consistency. So DevOps also means that the infrastructure of a system needs to change. And I don't think that a lot of teams and organizations understand how much that might be. But it includes things like testing and deployment scripts. There's a whole lot of things that it does include. It works. It truly does work. And there's a lot of reasons why. One of the things that I appreciate because, is the no long test and fix cycle, getting in there. Because we don't have those, then teams have more time to innovate, to try new things, to improve, because we're not wasting as much time with broken tests or test environments, or that whole throw it over the wall, toss it back and forth a few times, whether it's to testers or operations. I remember when I was working as a QA manager, it seems like such a long time ago, our release cycle was said to be every 6 months. But in reality, it was 5.5 months of development, 2 weeks maybe of testing. And then there was always a delay to fix the bugs, the back and forth, at least another month or two, depending on how bad it was. When we finally released to the customer, we actually put an operations person on site to install all the emergency bug fixes we knew we had to do. I do not miss that, not at all. So by the smaller cycles that we have now, the complexity is reduced, our risk is reduced, both from the development point of view, but also from the customer's perspective. Having that stable test environment, environments, put a plural, is a blessing. But I'm guessing many of you out there still struggle with that stability, at least with a lot of the teams I talk to. When teams work together and help define those fast feedback cycles and have the trust, that's when there is magic. That's when you get high performing teams. Those automated deployments and standardized things all help to make that magic happen, but it's really the people, the engagement of the people that make the difference. So DevOps is not a team. It's an organizational culture. It's a change in how you think, right? How do we deliver successfully? It incorporates the leadership team. For example, if you have a project management group that is constantly wanting to deliver more and more features without giving the team time to learn or to fix their infrastructure, really time to do their job, you're setting the team up for failure, right? So it's learning to change. It's learning to adapt and really think about it as a culture shift. Let's talk a little bit about quality now. I find that having this conversation about quality is really hard. And I use coffee as an example. So if you don't like coffee, think tea or any other kind of beverage that you would prefer, maybe lemonade or something. So in your mind, which of these do you like best? And I'm going to say that based on previous participation on this kind of thing, that it's an even split, right? Some people are like me. I like number one, the black coffee. Give it to me just plain black. Every once in a while, I'll have a cappuccino, but it is not my favorite way to have coffee. I asked my sister one time, I said, so what makes a good cup of coffee for you? And her choice is number two. In fact, that's her cup of coffee. And she said, well, I like when I go into my coffee shop and the barista gives me my cup of coffee, I order it. She always gives it to me the way I want it. I go sit down and I have this ambiance around, and I stopped her at that point and I said, but you're not talking about the coffee. You're talking about your emotions, how that coffee shop, how that cup of coffee in your hands makes you feel. So then she started talking about the coffee and the amount of milk put in it and so on. Most of us, and I'm going to ask you, why did you choose the cup of coffee? Is it because of the taste? Or maybe it's even the pretty design? That's from a user perspective. Now, how many of you thought about how it was made? Not just the barista who's making the coffee, but how it was grown. When were the coffee plants planted? How old are they? When were the coffee beans picked? How long did they stay out? How long did they dry? Were they roasted? Were they dark roasted, light roasted? Did they use oil in their roasting? Do they do it dry? How long was it sitting before the beans were ground? Did anybody think about that stuff at all? When we think about our product quality, all we care about is from the user perspective. Do you like the taste of the coffee? Would you come back and buy another cup? But the process of delivering that coffee, that's how we create our development, our products, right? So quality is a big word, and the meaning changes depending on how you look at it, what perspective. So for example, customers. Do we know our customers? Do we know how they use our product? We can use personas. So if we think about the coffee, people who like cappuccino, people who like black, is there a difference in what we serve and how we do things? What about the other stakeholders? Are there any others, right? The process is about how we create our product. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit. The product and product value, if we think about the coffee again, how much are you willing to pay for those specific features? For the ambiance, for the coffee shop? Are you willing to pay more for that black cup of coffee in a Starbucks or in that favorite coffee shop? Or would you rather go pay 50 cents at the local truck stop, right? So price, how is your company creating value? Is a company making enough profits? Because that's a stakeholder. They need to think about that. Do they depend on volume or versus price? Think about Rolex watches versus Omega. Quite a bit of difference in price, right? So we need to think about those things. It all goes into that conversation about quality. So it's more than the beans. It's more than the roasting or the pretty design. It starts with the environment. And it continues right up until the barista puts that pretty little design on the top, if you have a cappuccino. So part of it might be how we think about testing. Can we think about it differently? Testing is not a phase. It is an activity that happens throughout the delivery cycle. That is a quote from Elizabeth Hendrickson. And I think this is really at the heart of how I've changed my thinking about testing. Not a phase at the end. It happens throughout. So that's really what I'm going to be talking about today. So let's kind of move into the whole testing idea. So this is a typical DevOps loop, right? What you see is that they have testing as a phase, which just disagrees with everything I just said. So Dan Ashby tried to kind of fix that idea. So he created this infinite loop. He took out that test phase, and he started putting, we test here and here and here. I really like this. And I used this particular picture for a long time in my talks. But then I changed it a little bit. And so I did something that made more sense to me from a testing perspective. So if we think about this loop, a development cycle would typically start at the discover stage, right? What do we want to build? And then we plan, we seek to understand what we want to build, then we build it, we deploy it, and then we release to our customers and we observe how they use it. And hopefully we learn something and then move on to discover new things. Perhaps based on that particular feature we've been working on, or maybe it's something new and different. So I've added kind of this holistic, all these testing kind of ideas to match this loop. And I called it holistic testing. Dan called it continuous testing, and I was just fine with that, but it's been hijacked, the term continuous testing. A lot of the vendors have hijacked it to mean automation, completely automation in their DevOps, to mean the pipeline, the automation in the pipeline specifically. And no matter how many times we try to say continuous testing involves more, that's not. So I decided that I wanted a different word. I know I've heard the word omni, and that doesn't resonate with me, so I've used the word holistic because it feels better to me. When we think of testing from a holistic point of view, we realize that there's really many different types of testing. There's no beginning or end, but we're going to start at what we normally think is the beginning, that discover stage. Sometimes we go slow, sometimes we go fast, and there will be loops in there, but I'm trying to make this model as simple as possible. So we move from the left side to the right side. Generally speaking, and I know maybe some of you have read my blog post about why I hate the term shift left, shift right. And I hate it when I didn't like it when it's applied to a linear line, because that indicates a stop and a start. So if I apply shift left and shift right to this infinite loop, then it makes sense. Right? The left side is what we're trying to learn and to build, and the right side is more that whole pipeline idea and thinking about it. So let's kind of talk in more detail about this. So the first testing that is completed is in that discover, right? We're just the business folks. They're the ones that determine whether this idea has value. They are testing their ideas. At least I hope that's what they're doing. And asking, does it make sense from a business perspective? Now, if a organization does not have a consistent message in their vision, this is where we sometimes see a lot of confusion and competing priorities. So really the first testing that happens. Then we move on to the planning. So this is where we're testing early, our first chance to get maybe the team involved in testing. This is often where testers can add a whole lot of value using their critical thinking skills, asking what if questions, perhaps facilitating a risk storming exercise if a new feature has many unknowns, helping to break down stories so that they're testable. And then we get to the understand, the seeking to understand. And this is where practices like acceptance test driven development or behavior driven development help teams to understand. I encourage teams to use example mapping to help understand the business rules. Do we have enough? Do we have them all? Do we understand it? We want to involve the domain folks and programmers to determine maybe what kind of instrumentation we need to build so that we can monitor and observe customer behavior. This all happens before we start coding, right? And there's not a lot in this model. There's not room to put everything in. But thinking about test data would also be part of the seeking to understand. Lisa and I have been writing a series of blog posts and in our video chats, trying to talk about some of the specific methods, something like dependency mapping, right? So all of these types of testing are completed before a single line of production code have been written. The goal is on preventing defects in the code. So as we move into the building part of it, right? The coding, the automating, the testing, not necessarily in that order. And I'm not going to dwell on this stage because I think this is the one you are the most familiar with, right? We're going to automate the checks to get regression testing happening and get fast feedback, the unit tests by the programmers, business rules, maybe through the API level, even automation through for the workflows, right, through the user interface, although that might not be the focus. We also want to think about fast feedback, and it might include things like show me's or desk checks. When a programmer is finished coding, one of my favorite things to hear is, "Hey, Janet, can I show you?" So I'm going to pair with that programmer. They're going to show me what they walk me through it. I will ask questions. Very fast feedback, because the programmer might not have even checked in their code yet. So there's a lot of human-centric testing activities here, like exploratory testing or pairing at all kinds of different times. Maybe exploratory testing at the story level, maybe at the feature level when it's completed. So it's going to involve both automated and human-centric testing. So let's move to that right side. The code has been written. It's been deployed. It might have been deployed to the development environment, maybe to test environments. It'll depend on your process. And I separate out deployment because this is where a strong deployment pipeline really shows its strength. There's going to be some human-centric tests along the way as well. And I'll touch on that in a little bit. There's a lot of testing activities, and this is often where we get the opportunity to test some of those quality attributes like load, performance, stability, recovery. Some of these are a little harder to do in the team environment, and you need to deploy to something a little bit bigger. So let's go to release. This is release to production, right? So maybe we use feature toggles to, if we're doing continuous delivery or continuous deployment, we use release toggles to hide it, right? So we can test, but the customers can't see it yet. Or perhaps we use the idea of a blue-green environment to enable extra testing. So just in case you don't know what that is you might have two environments. They're exactly the same. So the blue environment is what the customers see. The customers will be looking at everything on the blue environment. The green environment mimics it, but it's got all of the new features or stories that you have on it now. And so you can test in production. The customers never see it. When you say, "We're good to go," you flip the switch, and all of a sudden the green environment is now what the customers see, and the blue environment will now be where your new features are going. It's more complicated than that, but that's kind of the easiest way to explain it, right? Today's tools enable us to do testing in production safely and responsibly. In my early days, testing in production was a scary thing because it meant affecting your customers. And so the tools as we move forward are a great way to help us. So our features are in production. Our customers are using them. As we observe, and this is where that instrumentation comes in, when we thought about it early in the cycle, what can we put in? What can we monitor? And then we put it in during the build cycle. And it comes full circle because now we can actually detect errors earlier, hopefully, than the customer, and often fix them before they even happened. So we want to observe how are our customers really using them instead of guessing. And the last part of this cycle I'll talk about is the learning. If we approach learning with a scientific mind, we will form a hypothesis based on our observations. We will try new experiments to improve. So when we put it all together, the left side, preventing defects in the code, the right side, observing, finding defects maybe and fixing it as quickly as possible. Remember, the right side is more expensive than the left, but we need both. Holistic. We have to look at that big picture. It's not one thing without everything else. Now, that left side, the testing early, it's all about asking questions and seeking to understand. Sometimes testers are the one that can really demonstrate their critical thinking skills early, right? Asking those. For testers to do this, they need to be part of that cross-functional team, working hand in hand with the programmers. As we build, we start to have these checks and balances, checks within checks. We're going to pair to discuss the tests. That's magic as well. What tests go at what level? What do we need to automate? What do we need to test with exploratory testing? So we think about the automation. So perhaps the programmer thinks about the code, those test automation methods. The tester thinks about what those test ideas are. The two of them together pair. And then when they've got those tests written, the developer takes that test, they run it, of course it'll fail, but then they start doing their own development cycle. Ideally TDD, but not necessarily. And so they keep doing that until all of those business level tests are passing, right? We now have code, we now have automated tests. We've also been, we get to have some other tests and checking. This is where that human-centric tests often come in, although I will pair with the programmer all along the way. Any other kinds of testing that needs to get it to done, and then we accept it, right? So that building cycle, it's full of these checks and balances to try to prevent codes from escaping the iteration or their story development. So when we think about all of these kinds of testing, and I have to say, so how's it fit with our deployment pipeline, right? So is your testing part of the pipeline? Does it enhance, or is it causing bottlenecks? So this is a very simplified version of a pipeline, really simplified. But you can start to see how thinking about which tests need to be run in which environment can help us. So in our local environment, maybe we run our unit tests, a static analysis. In our CI build environment, that's where we run our unit tests, maybe the API automated tests. In our development deployment, we've deployed, right? Then maybe that's where we run those user, the workflow tests that we've automated. Maybe our test environment, which is where we do our exploratory testing. Maybe that's where we do our user acceptance testing. Everybody will be different, but we need to think about what goes in where, right? In our staging, perhaps that's the first time we get to connect to other pieces of our system. Maybe this is where we do our recovery or performance testing. Pipelines can be much more complicated than this, and usually are. And then in production, of course, that's where we do our observability and monitoring and testing in production. But we have to think about the infrastructure that goes into that pipeline. Years ago, I worked with a test infrastructure team, and that's what they did. They tested the infrastructure. But these days, we can spin up test environments. They're up in the cloud. We can take them down just as easily. And that's what we mean by infrastructure as code. So we need to think about that as well. How are we testing that? Is it part of our testing? Do we understand what that means? So if we look at a little bit more complicated pipeline, continuous delivery, you can see, so the blue is automated steps, the yellow is human-centric steps. And this is from Ashley Hansberger and Lisa Crispin talk that they've done in the past. And it shows you that you can have the human-centric tests. Maybe they bottleneck a little bit if you're dependent on them. So you can see that you cannot move to the staging environment until you finished accessibility and exploratory testing. In this case, you have to do user acceptance testing before you can do deployment to production. Both of those are human-centric activities. People have to do them. As you can see, testing is part of the system. I like to think of it, testing as the heart of DevOps, because it's really part of everything we do. And I don't think we give it enough emphasis. This is a continuous deployment. You can see that the human-centric testing has been put into parallel. So nothing is dependent on it. Might be deploying to production behind a feature toggle. And so when we do that user acceptance testing and exploratory testing isn't dependent on putting it into production. Flipping the switch might be, right? And again, I want to stress that these steps are mostly all about testing, and the tools these days enable us to do it. So those enablers, right? They're the techniques, the tools, the processes that allow us to build quality into our product. Feature toggles, talked about them a little bit. They're not as easy as you would think to test. So I encourage people to read Katrina Clokey's Practical Testing for DevOps on how to learn how to test these. So working alongside of the developers, that to me is a really key process. Being able to be part of those conversations, feeding off each other's strengths. Just the other day, I heard another tester losing their job because management thought developers can do all the testing. To me, this is sad. I find that many, not all, teams that do this end up hiring the testers back because they didn't realize how much value they actually offered. And they didn't spend the time to train the developers in what they needed to know. So there's always a trade-off. So really think about that. Quality attributes. These are becoming more and more important, and thinking about them as a constraint with each and every story, talking about them, building them in with each and every story, enable us to move a little bit quicker. We don't have to go back and revisit and change things because we're thinking about it early. Exploratory testing, doing it early. It's a skill, and it's one that can be practiced at every level. Just keep thinking about how early can we do it. To me, the automation is what we thought about. So no matter how many tests I think about, I'm going to forget things. There's a lot of things I don't think about, and there's usually plenty. When we think about testing as an activity, it means that anybody can pick up a testing task. That helps reduce bottlenecks. It's true, but like anything, some people do some tasks better. Developers are a prime example of being able to automate a test method because they've got years and years of experience of coding. I know I could do it, but I cannot do it as well or as fast. But as a tester, I can help define the tests, and I can usually do that better. Strengths, right? One of the things that I often see is a task that says test this story. That's a red flag to me because it's making the testing activities invisible. And that's not what we want to do. We want to make people aware of all of the things that testing activities are. So those are just a few of the things that enable teams to implement continuous delivery. So I just kind of want to wrap up now so there's time for questions. Testing is different than it used to be. I think back to when I used to write test scripts, when I used to tell my manager that, no, I don't want to give my tests to the developers first. Yes, I did that. I just shake my head and I shudder at the thought. But I believe that testers are still important, but I think they need to find different ways to work, right? One of the things they can do is lead the discussion about quality and what to test, lead things like risk storming questions or dependency mapping. Doesn't mean they own quality, right? The whole team does, and that includes developers and the business and product owners, the whole team. So we need to start that conversation about quality. And I find a lot of teams struggle with that. Once we have that conversation going, then we can start to think about what testing activities support the level of quality we want. So it's not enough to make sure that the product works. We need to satisfy the needs of the customer, but we also need to be able to have input into how to build it. So if your teams are not talking about quality first, each one of you has that opportunity to start that conversation. But if you don't have that conversation, how do you ever know what testing needs to be done? How do you know what risks to consider? One way is to start thinking about the quality attributes. These are often forgotten, and to me, they're one of the most important things. So based on the risks that the team identified at the beginning during planning, you want to think about getting everybody on the same page, the organization, the team, make sure they all understand what is important. So try and experiment. Make a list of all the quality attributes you think are important. So on this slide, I have reliability, accessibility, performance, scalability. You can have 10, you can have 20, right? Make that list, put sliders on it, scale of 1 to 10. Make sure you say which is the most important so that people know what to choose. So on this picture, I have 1s as the most important, 10 as the lowest priority. So from my perspective, I think reliability is about a 7. Accessibility, not so important. Maybe this is internal and it's only for, I don't know, somebody. But what you want to do is get everybody on the team to do this independently and then compare. It might surprise you what people think is important or not. It's an interesting experiment to take that same list and ask the business folks, maybe even the management, maybe even the executives. Does everyone have the same idea about what is important? Because it comes back down to, are you spending your time wisely? So, last slide. I've been talking about the whole team, and not only testers with respect to quality. I think testers can bring some essential skills, like they can lead the team in learning how to build the quality is, but they're not responsible for it. So when we think of that whole team, defining that team quality, it belongs to everyone. You need to think about how do other people relate to it. The product quality belongs to the business, but testers can help, right? By asking good questions, making them think about what is valuable. There's also process quality. How do we build the product? So this belongs to the team and the organization. Remember, it contributes to product quality, but doesn't define it. Think about that beans, picking and roasting those coffee beans. But sharing knowledge, this is where operations shares what they need to know and vice versa, making those connections. When you think about your product, do you know what your customers look for? How do they judge quality? How do you get that fast feedback? And that's by iterating, right? Building on it. Then you can think about how your team can contribute to building that quality in. So it's all about fast feedback, right? And to be able to get that fast feedback, sometimes you need to collaborate. I'm a firm believer in visualization. Get it up on a whiteboard, get it up on a white, any kind of virtual board you can, but visualize your pipeline, write it up, get a big whiteboard. What are all the steps that you need to do? What are the testing that happens? That's how you get a shared understanding of what's going on. And then lastly, continual learning means a no blame culture. If you have blame, if you don't have that trust, it's really hard. That no blame culture enables people to try to innovate and get better. It means that mistakes will be made, but without mistakes, there's no learning. You just keep doing the same thing. And then using that scientific mindset to experiment, grow, and find new opportunities. Think holistically, think culture, think quality. And with that, I promised my contact information, so there it is. And all right. Take care.